You didn't stumble onto this by accident. That's the first thing worth sitting with. Out of everything competing for your attention right now, out of 10,000 other things you could be doing, something in you paused here. And Carl Jung would tell you that the timing of that pause is not as random as it feels. He spent the last decades of his life studying the strange way meaningful things arrive at the exact moment a person is ready for them. A phenomenon he called synchronicity, not magic, not superstition, something quieter and stranger, the way the outer world sometimes mirrors an inner readiness you haven't consciously admitted yet. So let me say it plainly, because you may need to hear it stated before you can believe it. If you found this, there's a good chance you're standing at the edge of the most important chapter of your life. And the reason it doesn't feel that way, the reason it might feel more like an ending than a beginning, is exactly what we're going to talk about. Jung understood something about transformation that almost no one prepares you for. The threshold of your best chapter rarely announces itself with excitement or clarity. It announces itself with a strange stillness, a flatness, a sense that the life you built, the one that looked right on paper, has gone quiet in a way you can't explain to anyone. You keep waiting to feel grateful for what you have, and instead, you feel like you're standing in a room after the party has ended, surrounded by decorations that no longer mean anything. He watched this pattern play out in hundreds of people who came to him during what looked, from the outside, like collapse. Careers dissolving, marriages going cold, identities cracking down the middle. Their families saw crisis. The world saw someone losing their grip, but Jung, sitting across from them, saw something else entirely. A psyche clearing ground for something that couldn't grow in the soil of the old life. Today, I want to walk you through what he actually discovered about this threshold. Why the beginning of your best chapter almost always wears the mask of an ending. What's really happening inside you when everything familiar starts to feel hollow. The specific signs that you're not breaking down but breaking through. And why the discomfort you might be feeling right now. The disorientation, the loss of interest, the sense of standing on ground that won't stay solid, is not a sign that something's gone wrong. It's the exact sensation of something finally going right. Let's start with the stillness, because that's usually where it begins. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over your life right before it changes. You won't recognize it while you're inside it, because it doesn't feel like the doorstep of anything good. It feels like stagnation, like the universe forgot your address and moved on to someone more deserving. Everything you were working toward seems to have stalled. The relationships that used to fill you leave you feeling oddly alone, even when you're with people. The version of yourself you spent years constructing doesn't fit anymore. The way a coat you've outgrown still hangs in your closet. Familiar, expensive, and completely wrong for who you've become. Jung had a word for what's happening underneath that stillness. He borrowed it from the old alchemists, whose strange texts he studied obsessively because he believed they'd stumbled onto psychological truths centuries before psychology existed. The word was nigredo, the blackening. In alchemy, it's the first phase of transformation, the stage where the raw material has to decompose completely before it can become anything of value. The alchemists knew you can't refine gold from ore without first breaking the ore down. The original structure has to dissolve. And that dissolving, from every angle, looks exactly like loss. Jung recognized that the human psyche moves through the same process. There are seasons in a life where everything that made up your identity, your roles, your certainties, your sense of who you are and what your days are for, begins to break down. And almost everyone who goes through it makes the same interpretation. They think they've failed. They think they've wasted their best years. They think the darkness settling over their life is the final act of a story that never quite worked. What Jung kept observing over and over was that this interpretation had it almost perfectly backwards. The darkness wasn't punishment, it was preparation. The psyche was tearing down a structure that had become too small to hold what was trying to emerge. Think about what winter does. Everything above ground goes still or dies back. The landscape looks barren, finished, like the earth has quit producing anything. If you didn't understand seasons, you'd assume it was over. But underneath the frozen surface, the soil is doing invisible work, restructuring, redistributing, letting root systems deepen in ways they never could during the frantic growing season. The apparent death is the precondition for growth that will be deeper and more alive precisely because of how complete the winter was. That's what the stillness in your life may actually be, not the end of the growing season, the quiet before the deepest roots you'll ever put down. And here's the part of Jung's insight that was genuinely radical for his time, and honestly still is. He didn't rush to fix the collapse. He didn't reach immediately for medication to numb the depression or advice to restore his patients to who they'd been. He recognized that the breakdown was doing the work. The dissolution was the healing. The darkness was accomplishing something no comfort could accomplish. This runs against everything the modern world teaches you about difficulty. We're trained to treat any suffering as a malfunction. Something hurts, you fix it. Something falls apart, you glue it back together as fast as possible. You feel lost, you find an answer immediately, before the discomfort becomes unbearable. There's an entire industry built on that impulse. Books promising rapid transformation, programs offering 3 steps to your best life, voices guaranteeing they can rush you past the painful part straight to the shiny result on the other side. Jung would have looked at all of that and recognized it for what it is: the ego's desperate strategy to avoid the one thing that could actually transform it. Because the ego doesn't want transformation. The ego wants improvement. It wants to become a better version of itself while staying fundamentally the same. It wants to add new achievements, new relationships, new skills to its existing structure without ever asking whether that structure needs to come all the way down. Real transformation, what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, asks for something the ego finds genuinely terrifying. It asks you to let the old structure fall without immediately replacing it. To tolerate a stretch of not knowing who you are, what you want, or where you're headed. To stand in the space between the life that's ending and the one that hasn't arrived, without sprinting through just because the in-between is unbearable. This is where most people lose the chapter that's trying to begin. Not because they're weak, because nobody ever told them the threshold was supposed to feel like this. The uncertainty gets too loud. The loss of identity feels too much like proof of failure. So they retreat. They go back to the relationship that was already dying. They recommit to the work that was quietly suffocating them. They reassemble the mask they'd finally started to set down. And from the outside, it looks like recovery, like they weathered the storm and came through intact. But Jung knew the storm was never something to weather. It was something to move through. And the people who fled it too early carried a specific ache for the rest of their lives. The quiet sense that there was a version of their life they almost lived. A self they almost became. A chapter that was reaching for them, and they wouldn't take its hand. So, if you're in that place right now, where everything feels stalled, where the old self doesn't fit and the new one hasn't shown its face, I want you to hear what Jung would have told you. You're not in a crisis, you're at a threshold. And the difference between those two words is the difference between a life that keeps circling its old patterns and one that finally breaks through into something true. Let me describe what this threshold actually looks like from the inside, because it's more specific than most people expect. Jung identified a set of psychological markers that showed up again and again in people approaching a major transformation. And the reason they get misread so consistently is that every one of them looks, on the surface, like something going wrong. The first marker is a creeping meaninglessness in the things that used to matter to you. You wake up and the life you built, the one that ticks every box that other people admire, feels strangely hollow, like a stage set for a play that already closed. You go through the motions because you don't know what else to do, but the emotional wiring that used to connect you to your routines, your goals, even people you love, has thinned out to almost nothing. Nobody around you notices because you're still performing well enough. Inside, though, you feel like you're watching your own life from a few feet behind your own eyes, and what you see doesn't quite make sense anymore. Jung understood this hollowing as the psyche withdrawing its energy from the structures the ego had built. When something has served its purpose in your development, the life force starts pulling back from it, the way sap retreats from the branches in autumn. The branches don't snap, they just go dry. And all that energy that used to flow outward starts pooling somewhere deeper, somewhere you can't yet reach, gathering to fuel something you can't yet see. The second marker is a sudden increase in dreams, strange moods, and things surging up from below. You start dreaming vividly, dreams that feel important even when they make no logical sense. Memories you haven't touched in decades float up unbidden. Emotions arrive out of nowhere. You might find yourself moved to tears by something small or hit by a wave of anger with no clear source. Old wounds you thought were long healed start aching again, as if they'd only been sleeping. Jung saw these eruptions as the unconscious making its move. When the ego's grip on your daily consciousness loosens, when the old identity begins losing its hold, everything that was pressed down underneath that identity starts rising. All the feelings you didn't have time for, all the parts of yourself you rejected to fit the life you built. It comes up because it's been compressed for years, sometimes decades, and the pressure behind it is enormous. The third marker is a deep pull towards solitude that the people in your life almost always misread. You start canceling plans. You crave time alone. Situations that used to energize you now drain something essential, and you can't quite explain why. You're not depressed exactly. It's more that every interaction seems to require you to perform a version of yourself that's becoming impossible to keep up. Jung understood this withdrawal as a necessary conservation of psychological energy. Transformation is expensive. It demands enormous internal resources, and the psyche begins redirecting energy away from the outer world and toward the inner rebuilding that's underway. Your need for solitude in this season is as legitimate as a body's need for rest during illness. Something inside you is being reconstructed, and that work asks you to stop giving your energy away to everyone and everything else. The fourth marker is the strangest to live through. It's the sense that you're becoming someone you don't recognize. Your tastes shift, your values move. Things you cared about desperately start feeling irrelevant. People you used to admire look different to you now. The goals that drove you for years lose their pull, and nothing has stepped in to replace them yet. You catch your reflection, and there's a flicker of a stranger there, someone you're in the middle of meeting but haven't been properly introduced to. Jung would have called this the emergence of the self, the deeper, more authentic center of the psyche that lives beneath the ego's constructed identity. When the ego's structure weakens, the self starts exerting its quiet pressure. And because the self is who you actually are underneath all the performance, its arrival feels foreign. You've spent your whole life being someone assembled out of expectations, survival strategies, and inherited scripts. Meeting the person underneath all of that is disorienting in a way that's hard to describe until you're in it. If several of these markers are ringing true right now, the flatness, the strange dreams, the hunger for solitude, the sense of becoming a stranger to yourself, then you're not falling apart. You're standing exactly where the transformation begins. And what happens next depends almost entirely on whether you can resist the nearly overwhelming urge to bolt back toward familiar ground. There's a reason that urge is so strong, and it's worth understanding, because understanding it is half of surviving it. The hardest part of the threshold isn't the loss. It isn't even the loneliness or the sense of watching your old life dissolve. The hardest part is the emptiness between what was and what's coming. Because there is a gap, a real one, a terrifying, seemingly endless space between the death of the old chapter and the birth of the new. And while you're in it, you have nothing to hold. Jung described this gap as a kind of psychological free fall. The structures you use to orient your whole life are gone or going. The identity you used to navigate the world has lost its shape. Your plans, your goals, your sense of what comes next, all of it has dissolved, and you're suspended in a void that the ego experiences as the single most threatening thing imaginable. Because the ego survives through structure, through knowing, through having a role, a story, a plan. Strip all of that away, and the ego goes into something close to primal panic. This is the moment most people break. They call the ex they know is wrong for them. They take the job they know will make them miserable. They apologize for changing and promise everyone they'll go back to who they were. They'll do almost anything to end the free fall, even if ending it means landing right back in the life that was quietly killing them. Jung saw this flight from the gap as the great missed opportunity of a human life, because the gap is where transformation actually happens. The void between identities is where the new self gestates. That emptiness that feels like nothing is actually the fertile dark, where something real, something that couldn't have existed inside the walls of your old life, is beginning to take shape. He compared it to the pause between breaths. There's a moment after you exhale completely and before you draw the next breath where nothing moves. Complete stillness. And that stillness is essential. Without it, the next breath can't begin. Trying to skip it, gasping for air the instant you exhale, doesn't produce more life. It produces hyperventilation, frantic, shallow breathing that feels like breathing but gives you nothing to live on. That's precisely what happens when people rush the threshold. They hyperventilate psychologically. They leap into a new relationship before understanding why the old one ended. They dive into a new career before facing what they were really running from. They construct a fresh identity before the old one has finished dissolving. And the life they build from that place of panic is thin. It has the appearance of a new chapter, but underneath, it's the old chapter with rearranged furniture. The people Jung watched emerge genuinely transformed were the ones who could bear the gap, who could sit in the void without filling it prematurely, who could hold the terrifying question, who am I if I'm not the person I've been performing, without rushing to answer it with the first available role. And I want to be honest with you, because Jung was honest about this. That kind of waiting isn't passive. It's one of the most demanding things a human being can do. Sitting with uncertainty while every cell in your body screams for resolution. Holding the emptiness while your mind races to fill it with plans and projections. Letting yourself be nobody for a while, when you've spent your entire life being somebody. Jung wrote about what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to bridge the conscious and unconscious mind during exactly this kind of intense tension. When you can hold two opposite states at once, when you can feel completely lost and somehow still trust the process, when you can honor what's ending while staying open to what's being born, something activates. And it produces a third thing, not a compromise between the two, a genuinely new position, a new identity, a new way of being that draws on parts of you that you didn't even know were there. But the transcendent function only works if you refuse to collapse into one side. Retreat fully into the old identity, and you've resolved the tension artificially. Leap prematurely into a new one, and you've bypassed the tension instead of working through it. The function requires you to stand in the middle, in the fire of not knowing, long enough for something authentic to rise on its own. If you're anywhere near that fire right now, if you've been sensing for a while that the life you've been living has become too small for what's stirring inside you, this might be exactly the moment to stop white-knuckling your way through it alone and start listening to what's actually trying to come through. That's the whole reason we put together the guide called True Self-Discovery. It's 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's approach to this in-between space, built not to rush you across the threshold, but to help you find your footing while the ground is still shifting. If any of this is landing in your body as you listen, the link is right below. It's a way to work with the process instead of enduring it. And now, let's keep going, because there's something about what emerges from this gap that almost nobody talks about. What Jung observed, again and again, is that when the gap is honored, when someone can bear the emptiness without forcing it to end, what comes through is always bigger than what came before. The new chapter, when it's allowed to arrive on its own terms, carries a quality of realness the old chapter never had. Because the old chapter was built out of accommodation, out of expectations, out of survival strategies and cultural scripts, and the accumulated shoulds of everyone who shaped you. The new chapter is built out of an actual encounter with the self, a genuine reckoning with who you are underneath all the performing. But before that new chapter can arrive, certain things have to be released. And this is the part where people often get frightened, because letting go of these things feels like losing pieces of yourself. It isn't. It's setting down armor you mistook for skin. The first thing that has to go is the ideal self. Everyone carries an image of who they're supposed to become, the perfected version, the person they'd finally be if they just tried hard enough. That ideal self is a collage assembled from every expectation ever laid on you. Your parents' unlived dreams, the culture's definitions of a successful life, standards you absorbed so young you never questioned whether they were even yours. And you've been chasing that image your whole life, calling the chase ambition. The threshold kills the ideal self, and it doesn't do it gently. It kills it with the brutal clarity of realizing that person was never real, that you were sprinting toward a ghost designed by other people's needs. This is devastating, because the ideal self was your engine. Without it, you don't know why you're doing anything. The career you were building suddenly looks pointless. The goals feel like they belong to a stranger. But here's what Jung understood. You cannot become who you actually are while still worshiping who you were supposed to be. The ghost has to be laid to rest so the living person can take up the room it occupied. The second thing that has to go is the story in which you had no part. Somewhere along the way, you built an understanding of your life that cast you as the one things happened to. And much of that might be true. Maybe you were genuinely wronged, genuinely wounded. But individuation asks for something more complicated than clean victimhood. It asks you to see where you participated, where you chose, where you stayed, where you repeated the very patterns you've been blaming on everyone else. Jung was unflinching about this, though he was careful to separate it from self-blame. The point isn't that you caused your suffering. The point is that you can't step into your best chapter while holding a story in which you have no agency. Because the same agency that participated in the old patterns is the exact agency you'll need to build new ones. Deny that it existed in the past, and you can't reach for it in the present. Reclaiming your role in your own story, even the painful parts, is what hands you the pen for the next chapter. The third thing that has to go is a certain kind of belonging. This is the one that undoes people, Because becoming your true self means, by definition, becoming an individual, no longer just a reflection of the group, a product of the family, a member of the tribe. And individuality, in its truest form, passes through a stretch of profound loneliness. Not because individuated people can't connect. Jung argued the opposite, that only individuated people can connect authentically. But the road there runs through a season of disorienting solitude, where you've outgrown the old circles and the new ones haven't formed yet. You find you can no longer take part in conversations that require the mask. You can't sustain relationships that were built entirely on your compliance. And the connections that will one day be built on who you actually are haven't arrived. You're in a kind of social no man's land, too changed for the old world and too new for whatever's coming. Jung knew this territory personally. During his own most intense period of self-confrontation, years he later described as the most important of his life, he withdrew from many of his professional relationships. He was isolated, misunderstood, dismissed by colleagues who could only read what he was going through as a breakdown. And yet he came to see that stretch as the source of everything meaningful he ever produced. Not despite the isolation, but because of what the isolation forced him to find inside himself, in a place nothing external could reach. That's what all this releasing is actually for. Every piece of pain in this process corresponds to something false being removed. And that's exactly what makes it so confusing, because the false things felt real. The ideal self felt like purpose. The story of victimhood felt like understanding. The old belonging felt like love. Setting down things that felt this solid, even when you know intellectually they were constructed, is genuinely hard. Your nervous system doesn't know the difference between releasing a false structure and losing a real one. To your body, it registers the same. But there's a reason Jung staked his life's work on the belief that it's worth it. He wrote, in one of his most quoted lines, that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. He didn't mean pain as punishment. He meant that consciousness, real self-knowledge, real ownership of your own life, cannot be reached by comfort. The layers that have to come off don't come off painlessly, because you've been fused to them so long you mistook them for yourself. Their removal feels like losing limbs. It isn't. It's losing weight you didn't know you were carrying. Now, here's a question worth sitting with. Why would anyone choose this? Why not keep the mask, maintain the structure, live the life that at least looks right and earns approval? Jung's answer changed how he understood the whole human situation. The false structure doesn't just limit what you show the world, it limits what you're able to experience. Inside the mask, your emotional range is capped at whatever the performance allows. Your capacity for joy is throttled by the exact same mechanism that throttles your grief. Your ability to love fully is blocked by the same walls that protect you from being fully seen. The old life didn't only hide you from other people, it hid life from you. Entering your best chapter isn't just about becoming your true self. It's about gaining access to the full spectrum of being alive. Yes, the lows can go lower, but the joy becomes more vivid than anything the old life ever permitted. The love becomes real because it's no longer filtered through performance. And the peace, when it comes, and it does come, isn't the manufactured calm of someone managing their image. It's the genuine stillness of someone with nothing left to hide. Jung was also careful to point out something most people miss entirely. Both paths hurt. Staying in the old life hurts too. It just hurts in a way the world finds acceptable and easy to numb. The dull ache of inauthenticity, the quiet desperation of living someone else's script, the slow erosion of vitality that comes from suppressing who you are for decades. That's real pain. It's just so common that most people don't even name it as pain. They call it being an adult. They call it responsibility. They call it just the way things are. The threshold hurts differently. It hurts sharply, visibly, in ways you can't numb. But the pain of becoming is the pain of something healing, while the pain of avoiding is the pain of something dying slowly. And based on decades of watching both paths play out, Jung believed the first one leads somewhere, and the second one just keeps circling. Let me make this less abstract, because the concept can only carry you so far. Picture someone, maybe not so different from you. They spent 15 years building a life that looked like success from every angle. A good career, a stable relationship, the respect of the people around them, all the markers checked. And then something started to shift. The work that once felt meaningful began to feel like a cage. The relationship that once nourished them began to feel like a role they were reading from. They'd lie awake at 3 in the morning with a weight on their chest they couldn't explain, because nothing was technically wrong. Everything was exactly what they'd worked for. And that was the most disorienting part, realizing that getting everything they wanted still left them hollow. For a while they tried to fix it from inside the structure. New responsibilities at work, therapy for the relationship, new hobbies, more travel, more exercise, stacks of books. Each fix brought a brief hit of relief before the emptiness seeped back in, a little deeper each time. Because none of it touched what was actually happening. They were rearranging furniture in a house that needed to be rebuilt from the foundation. Then came the season Jung would have recognized instantly. Everything started to come apart, and this time the fixes stopped working. The relationship that had been on life support finally ended. The career path became genuinely unbearable. Friendships sustained purely by performance quietly fell away once the performing stopped, and they found themselves standing in the wreckage of the life they'd built, alone, disoriented, with no idea what came next. Everyone looking from the outside saw tragedy, saw failure, saw a life fall apart. Jung, looking at the same person, would have seen something entirely different. Someone whose psyche had finally gathered enough force to break through a false structure. The nigredo in full effect, the necessary blackening before the gold. Someone standing in precisely the right place, even though that place felt like the worst place they'd ever been. And what came next, for the ones who could hold the gap, unfolded in ways they never could have planned. Because the new chapter doesn't arrive the way the old one did, through goal setting and strategy and careful construction. It arrives through emergence, through a reorganization of what matters so fundamental that their whole orientation to life quietly rearranges itself. Jung noticed something almost poetic in these transitions. He borrowed a Greek word for it, enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite at the point of their greatest intensity. The stretch of deepest isolation often preceded the arrival of the most genuine connections of a person's life. The moment of most complete meaninglessness often gave birth to a sense of purpose more real than anything they'd known. The time they felt most lost turned out, in hindsight, to be the precise moment they finally started heading in the right direction. This drove his more rational colleagues a little crazy because it sounded mystical, but he wasn't being mystical. He was describing a mechanism. When the ego's agenda finally exhausts itself, when all the plans and strategies and forced optimism run out of fuel, the deeper intelligence of the psyche gets its first real chance to speak. And that intelligence has been paying attention the whole time. It knows things about you that your busy, performing mind never had the quiet to notice. It knows what actually fulfills you, who you actually are, what kind of life would feel like breathing after years of holding your breath. It just couldn't get a word in while the ego ran the show. And when the new chapter comes, it rarely looks like what the old self would have chosen. The person who spent 15 years climbing might find themselves drawn to something that pays less, but fills a space the old life never touched. The one who performed in vulnerability might build relationships rooted in genuine vulnerability, where being seen finally matters more than being admired. The one who spent a lifetime trying to earn love might discover they can generate it from within, and that single discovery changes every relationship they'll ever have from that point on. Jung called this the second half of life, though it doesn't map neatly onto age. Some people reach this threshold at 30, others don't arrive until 60, and some never arrive at all, spending their whole lives inside the first chapter, the one built from other people's expectations, never discovering what was waiting underneath. What determines whether someone crosses over has less to do with the amount of suffering than you'd think. Plenty of people suffer enormously and never approach real transformation. The suffering just repeats. What brings someone to the threshold is a particular kind of honesty, the willingness to admit that the life they built, for all its visible success, isn't working at the level that matters most, that the performance has become intolerable, that the gap between who they appear to be and who they actually are has widened to the point where holding it together costs more energy than they can spare. That honesty is devastating because it means looking at years, sometimes decades, of choices and admitting they were driven by something other than genuine desire, by fear, by obligation, by the hunger for approval, by inherited ideas of what a good life is supposed to look like. There's no way to arrive at that recognition without feeling the weight of time spent building something that, in the end, wasn't really yours. But here's what Jung watched happen in the people who could sit with that recognition instead of running from it. The weight transformed. The heaviness over time spent living someone else's script slowly became fuel for living their own. The regret didn't vanish, but it changed character, from self-punishment into motivation, from "I wasted those years" into "I finally understand what those years were teaching me, and I won't waste the ones I have left." There's a line of Jung's that people love to quote, and for good reason. "The privilege of a lifetime," he said, "is to become who you truly are." Notice the word he chose, privilege, not burden, not obligation. He understood that most people never get the chance, or never take it, to become who they actually are underneath the roles. So if you're standing at this threshold, feeling like the ground is dissolving, Jung would have you reframe the whole experience. This isn't the thing happening to you. This is the privilege arriving, wearing the disguise of loss. He also wouldn't let you believe you were chosen for this because you're weak or broken. He'd point out the opposite. The psyche doesn't initiate this dismantling in someone who can't survive it. The unconscious doesn't tear down a structure it isn't ready to help rebuild. The very fact that this is happening to you at all is evidence that something in you is strong enough to be rebuilt from the foundation. The demolition itself is a vote of confidence from the deepest part of you. Sit with that for a second, because it inverts everything. The thing that feels like proof you're falling apart is actually proof that something inside you is finally ready to build something real. The threshold chooses people who are ready, especially when, maybe most of all when, those people don't feel ready in the slightest. So what does the best chapter actually look like when it finally arrives? Jung's answer surprised even his closest followers, because he didn't describe it in terms of circumstances. He didn't talk about better relationships, better work, better material conditions, though those often followed on their own. What he described was an internal shift so fundamental that it changed a person's entire relationship with being alive. He described people who, after crossing the threshold, developed what he called a relationship with the self, a felt sense of being anchored in something deeper than their social identity, something that couldn't be taken from them by a job loss or a breakup or someone's disapproval, a center of gravity that existed independent of the outside world, and that gave them a quality of presence other people could feel but couldn't quite name. These people moved through the world differently, They made decisions from a different place, from inner alignment instead of external pressure. They could tolerate uncertainty because they'd already survived the ultimate uncertainty of not knowing who they were. They could be alone without being lonely, because they'd discovered that the companionship they'd spent their lives seeking from others was available from within. They could engage fully without being desperate, because their sense of being okay no longer depended on the outcome. Jung noticed they also developed a tolerance for complexity that most people never reach. They could hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. They could see the shadow in good things and the beauty in hard things. They lost the need for simple stories, the need for everything to be either a success or a failure, either right or wrong. And their lives became richer and more textured for it, because they'd stopped flattening experience into categories. And maybe most importantly, they developed a different relationship with time. They stopped living in anticipation, always reaching for the next milestone, the next proof that their life was working. And they stopped living in regret, endlessly reviewing the past for evidence of mistakes. They became more present than they'd ever been, because the threshold had taught them the one thing the performing mind can never learn on its own, that the present moment is the only place real life actually happens. Everything else is just the mind's story about a past that's gone, or a future that hasn't come. That's what Jung meant by the best chapter of a person's life. He meant the chapter where you finally stop performing and start living, where the energy that used to go into maintaining appearances gets redirected into genuine experience, where relationships are built on truth instead of need, where your work serves something deeper than your image, where the anxious question, "Who am I?" is quietly replaced by the lived experience of simply being yourself, maybe for the first time in your life. And here is the part I don't want to soften, because Jung never softened it. The doorway to that chapter runs directly through the discomfort you might be feeling right now, through the loss, through the dissolving of the familiar, through the gap that feels like it might swallow you whole, through the free fall of not knowing who you are or what comes next. There's no path around it. Jung searched his entire career and never found one. The darkness is the path. The falling apart is the coming together. The season that feels most like an ending, the one where nothing makes sense and you can't find a single reason to believe things will ever feel different, is doing something you can't perceive from inside it. It's clearing the ground, preparing the soil, making space for something your old life, with all its careful achievements, never had room to hold. You, standing at this threshold, tired and unsure, and watching the familiar fall away. That's what the beginning of the best chapter feels like before you can see it as a beginning. It feels like an ending, every single time. For every person Jung ever studied, the beginning wore the face of an ending first. Your only work right now is to keep standing, to resist the pull back toward what's familiar but finished, to bear the not knowing for one more day, and then one more after that. To trust that the emptiness you're feeling isn't the absence of meaning. It's the space where meaning that's actually yours, not inherited, not borrowed, not performed for anyone else, is quietly gathering the strength to emerge. There's another line of Jung's worth holding on to here. "Who looks outside dreams," he wrote. "Who looks inside awakes." For your whole life, the world has trained you to look outside, for direction, for validation, for proof that you're on the right track. The threshold takes all of that away precisely so you'll finally look in. The stripping away of external certainty isn't cruelty. It's an invitation, disguised as loss, to wake up. And I want to return to where we started, because it matters more now than it did at the beginning. You found this. Out of everything you could be doing, something in you paused here, at this particular moment in your particular life. Jung would not call that meaningless. He'd call it the outer world quietly mirroring an inner readiness you might not have consciously admitted yet. The fact that these words are reaching you now, when the ground feels least solid, is exactly the kind of quiet synchronicity he spent his last decades trying to help people notice. The way what you need has a strange habit of arriving right as you become able to receive it. So let this land as what it is, a signal. Not that everything is about to get easy, because it won't, but that you're closer than the darkness would have you believe. The transformation doesn't announce itself with trumpets and light. It announces itself with stillness, with loss, with the unbearable feeling of standing on ground that keeps shifting. That shifting is the beginning. You're already in it. You've been in it for a while, maybe, calling it by the wrong name. Give it its right name now. Not a breakdown, a threshold, not the end of your story, the blackening before the gold, the winter before the deepest roots you'll ever put down, and the chapter waiting on the other side of it, the one your psyche has been building toward in every restless night, every hollow afternoon, every inexplicable urge to walk away from the life you built. That chapter is more real than anything you've lived so far. It doesn't look like what they promised. It looks like something better than what they promised. It looks like yours. Stay in the threshold. Let the old story end. And pay close attention, because what emerges from this silence is going to be the truest thing you've ever known. If any part of this has been speaking to where you actually are, raw, in between, unsure whether the ground will ever solidify again, then take a look at the guide we built for exactly this stretch of the road. It's called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, designed not to rush you across the threshold, but to walk beside you while you're standing in it. A way to start hearing what's trying to come through, instead of drowning it out with panic. The link is right below.